Good afternoon. Thank you for attending the Dairy Animal Nutrition and Mammary Health webinar sponsored by the Ohio Ecological Food and Farm Association and the Ohio State University College of Veterinary and Preventative Medicine. This webinar is presented by Dr. William Weiss, Professor and Extension Specialist in Dairy Nutrition for the Ohio State University's Animal Science Division. My name is Eric Pulaski, Sustainable Agriculture Educator for OFA, and I will moderate this presentation. OFA supports sustainable and organic production practices, ecological advocacy, and organic certification across the Midwest. You can learn more about us on the web at www.ofa.org. The Ohio State University is your go-to source for fresh and local information on all things agriculture here in Ohio. You can find them on the web at www.osu.edu. This webinar is funded through the North Central Region Sustainable Agriculture Research and Education, sponsored by the United States Department of Agriculture. NCR-SARE has provided more than $40 million to our region in support of agriculture research and education over the last 10 years. We thank SARE for this support. Questions will be moderated this afternoon. Please type your questions into the box on your screen. Questions will be held until the designated period at the end. We are pleased and fortunate to introduce Dr. William Weiss of the Ohio State University. He will present on dairy nutrition and mammary health. So without further ado, Dr. Weiss.
Thank you. Let me get adjusted. All right, thank you for that introduction. Today's seminar is on a relationship between nutrition and mammary gland health. And when I talk about this, I always want to start with this slide, and that is you have to remember mastitis is not caused by poor nutrition. It's caused by a pathogen, usually a bacteria, that infects the mammary gland. Nutrition or poor nutrition is a risk factor, but it is not a cause. And really, there's a war going on in all living animals, and that's the fight between survival and invading or pathogens. And a cow is no different. It's basically a cow gets mastitis when her ability to fight pathogens is less than the pathogen load. And what this means is if you have a very clean, comfortable environment, there will be fewer pathogens, and it takes less immune function to fight those. If the cow is in a very stressful environment, the immune system is challenged more, so it's a balance. Nutrition really has minimal effect on pathogen load. That's other factors, hygiene, cleanliness, things like that. Nutrition, however, does affect immunity, and that's what I'm going to be emphasizing during this webinar. We look at nutrition has two ways it can affect I'm either going to use the term immunity or host defense. They're not quite synonymous, but they mean about the same thing. But good nutrition is needed by the immune system, or the immune system needs nutrients, and they need certain nutrients more than other systems do. So one role nutrition has is to provide the optimal amounts of nutrients, which will allow the immune system to function properly and the immune cells to function properly. That results in a strong host defense, good immune system, and healthier cows. So that's one approach. The other thing, good nutrition reduces what we call immunosuppressors. These are compounds produced by the cow under conditions where nutrition is not good. And these compounds have negative effects on immune system or immune function and other things as well. So again, our goal is to provide the immune system with the nutrient it needs and prevent these adverse chemicals, these adverse compounds from being produced by the cow. And these are two different approaches. I'll cover each one separately, starting with the immunosuppressors. With mastitis, this is some old data from Larry Smith here at OERDC, where he tracked environmental mastitis over lactation. What I'm showing is coliforms, but this is true for all environmental pathogens. It also is true to a lesser degree for contagious pathogens, Staph aureus and so on. And what this graph is showing is the prevalence of infection for various lactations, and that really doesn't matter, over lactation. And the key here is that in early lactation, fresh cows, they're extremely susceptible to mastitis, and at least a third of mastitis generally occurs and this is true for all mammals, not just cows, but cows tend to do this worse than or more than other animals. About a week before she's due to calve, the immune system becomes less functional. We call it immunosuppression, and this is a normal event. We cannot prevent this. But so various aspects of the immune system become less and less able to do its job. And it stays suppressed for a few days after calving, and then it starts regaining and going back to where it is. And again, this is normal for the cow. We call it normal immunosuppression. And the only way to prevent this is to have the cow not give a calf, which obviously in the dairy business, we can't do that. So that we're stuck with. But then there's also this diet-induced immunosuppression. And poor nutrition in the peripartum period leads to nutritional immunosuppression. And I'm going to spend some time on that. Another problem right around calving is these cows aren't eating a lot. So her intake of all nutrients, not just the ones we really care about for immune function, but all nutrients are down. And at the very same time, her need for nutrients are increasing substantially because she's now producing lots of milk. And so we have this imbalance, even though we try to formulate good diets, because she doesn't eat enough and is producing a lot of milk early in lactation, there's always going to be deficiencies. So we're dealing with all these things. Some we can do something about, some we can't. This nutritional immunosuppression, we can really, it's a little more complicated than this, but basically it's related to excessive body weight loss, which we call high NEFAs. This is non-esterified fatty acids, and when the demand for energy is less than what the energy that cow eats, she mobilizes fat, and that's where the NEFAs, the fatty acids, come from. So situations that produce a lot of energy mobilization or fat mobilization induces immunosuppression or makes immunosuppression worse. Ketosis, both subclinical and clinical, suppress immune function. So again, if you're having cows with, and subclinical is much more common than clinical, but if you're having cows with subclinical ketosis, they're at much higher risk for mastitis than those normal cows. So we're interested in feeding cows to prevent ketosis, again, subclinical and clinical. And then lastly, at calving, hypocalcemia. And this is another word for milk fever. Milk fever is clinical hypocalcemia, where the cow is down and you have to give calcium. But subclinical hypocalcemia is a much bigger problem. And that's the cow appears normal, but her blood calcium is still low. That is a substantial risk for mastitis. So one goal with nutrition, and most of this is done prepartum, but a little of it postpartum, is to prevent metabolic disorders, and predominantly ketosis, hypocalcemia, and then we don't want these animals to go into too severe of negative energy balance. So it's easy to say those things. It's a little harder to achieve the goals. Okay, as I mentioned, when a cow calves, her intake is low. Just normal. It takes her a while to get geared up to start eating a lot. But at that same time, she is putting out a lot of energy into milk. And so to make up the difference, she mobilizes fat, body fat, and this is a normal event. We just don't want it to be excessive. And this cartoon I'm showing is obviously very, very excessive. But we want cows to mobilize some weight. That's, again, a normal condition. We just have to keep it in check. And when she mobilizes body fat, what we see is always high NEFAs, non-esterified fatty acids. That has to be. She may or may not have high ketones. That's flexible. In other words, a cow can have a lot of mobilization and not have ketosis. They often go together, but not necessarily. But ketones are only produced when they are mobilizing fat, but just because they're mobilizing it doesn't mean they get ketones. I'm just going to real quick show some data. I'm not going to go into any detail, but the point of these slides, I've got a couple of slides here showing immune cell. Lymphocytes are just one type of immune cell. PMN is another type. And what I'm showing here is increasing concentrations of NEFA have a direct negative effect on the function of these cells. A lot of people think the immune system is down just because cows are in negative energy balance. That's not the reason. There is a direct negative effect of NEFAs on these cells. So again, keeping plasma NEFAs low will hopefully improve immune cell function. And the same thing with ketones. BHBA is an abbreviation for ketones, beta-hydroxybutyric acid, but that's the primary ketone. This is a measure of immune function in the neutrophil. And these are various levels of ketones that these cells were incubated in. This red arrow here, this is where we call anything over on this side is a normal cow. This side is subclinical ketosis. If it gets at probably at the orange, you're very much getting close to clinical ketosis. And all this is showing, again, is there is a direct negative effect of concentration of ketones on immune cell function. So, cows with ketosis have lots of problems, but this is direct. And again, it's just emphasizing the importance of reducing excessive energy loss or body weight loss and ketosis. There's direct other data, which I won't show, just showing cows with ketosis get more mastitis. There's direct links that way and some other things. But the point is, cows losing a lot of condition, cows with ketosis, high risk for mastitis and other infectious disease. So how do we prevent this? Well, the goal here is to prevent negative or severe negative energy balance is cows have to eat. Once they calve, they have to eat. And the more they eat and the faster intake goes up, the less likely you'll get ketosis and the less likely you'll have severe negative energy loss. One of the biggest problems here with low intakes postpartum is fat cows. You would think, fat cows have a lot of body fat, obviously, and they should be less prone to these things. But fat cows, once they calve, their drive to eat is very low, and they take off very, very slowly. So one thing we need to work on is getting cows in the proper body condition before they dry off. These have to be done before they dry off. The goal here on a body condition score, most people are now saying they want most cows to calve and dry off at a score of about 3.5 on a scale of 1 to 5. 5 being really fat and 1 being really, really thin. So, decent, you want some fat on these guys or some condition because they need to mobilize stuff. Just don't over-condition them. And if you're having a lot of trouble with fat cows at dry off, what you really need to look at is you're feeding too much energy to those animals relative to other nutrients. For example, if you do see a lot of fat cows in late lactation, you might think one reason might be you're deficient in protein. So the animals are not making milk, they're making body weight. So make sure that the diet is balanced for adequate production. Cows that are not get pregnant very late or can't get bred back very often get fat because it's just so late into lactation. And if this is a big problem for your farm, you really need to think about having a group and a diet specifically for late lactation over-conditioned cows. And these diets are typically higher in protein and lower in starch or grain. And with that adjustment, you can peel some weight off these and get them down to the right condition. And again, it is very, very bad if you put dry cows on diets. You do not want to do that. So if a cow is fat when she dries off, you're pretty much stuck with a fat cow until calving. So work on late lactation nutrition. The dry period. This is for a lot of organic farms graze at least part of the year, and that helps this dry cow problem because in confinement, we tend to, it's very difficult to feed the proper amount of energy to a dry cow because their demands are so low. And the typical dry cow in confinement is overfed energy. So she's actually gaining condition, a little bit of condition every day during the dry period, and that sets her up for ketosis after she calves. So basically what we try to do is formulate dry cow diets where this is for a Holstein. If you've got a Jersey, multiply that number by about 0.8. We try to formulate diets that will fill up a cow with about 26 or 27 pounds of dry matter. And to do that, these have to be relatively high fiber, low digestible diets. So we feed straw, more mature hay, things like that. So the cow eats, we want her full, we just don't want her to overeat energy. This is how much energy she needs, which is very little, but if this is for confinement, but if she's grazing, you can easily tack on about 2 megacows, which again means it's harder for grazing dry cows to put on condition. So that's a benefit of that. But watch carefully. If your nutritionist sits down and says these cows, if they're eating what we think they're eating, is eating much more than this, if they're in confinement, you need to tone it down. You need to get these diets lower energy, and again, you just feed more and more fiber, less and less concentrate to get the intakes about 26 pounds for a Holstein. This shows you what happens when we overfeed energy in the dry period. That's the blue line here. We feed a high quality diet. They eat a lot, which some people think is good, and in lactation it is good, but in the dry period it's not so good. These cows are in positive energy balance. They're gaining weight. Then about a week or two before calving, when they're in that mode, there's a physiological trigger that tells these cows don't eat so much, stop eating. And we see this drop in intake. And this drop in intake really sets these cows up for ketosis and mobilization of body fat. So this is what we want to avoid. And by feeding these, what we call these high fiber, low energy diets, what we see is they eat less. So they're in neutral energy balance. They're not getting fat. They're not getting thin. And we just don't see this drop off at calving. And then they take off. Once they calve, they really take off. So again, we want to avoid real high intakes. Dry cow diets with lots of corn silage fits the blue line. So we want to avoid overfeeding corn silage in the dry period, overfeeding concentrate. We want to feed enough, but just not too much. And then don't forget the goal here in there's two types of ketosis. One is peripartum ketosis, which is mostly related to dry cow nutrition and this big drop in intake prepartum. The other type of ketosis happens a little later, maybe a week or two into lactation. That's caused by the cow just running out of energy, feed energy. And so the other goal, once these cows calve, and I mentioned this earlier, we have to do everything we can to get cows to eat. We want this intake curve. I'm going to back up a minute. We want these guys postpartum just to take off like crazy, really eat. And some of this involves cow comfort. We want uncrowded stalls. If they're in confinement, most of the time you want, feed these cows twice a day, Do everything you can to encourage eating. On diets, you want really good, the best forage on the farm should be fed to fresh cows. If you're grazing, you want, they get first dibs on the grazing, on the pasture. If you're feeding, you've got different qualities of hays, these guys get the best hay. Everything has to be highly digestible. We don't want to go extra on fiber, but we need enough to keep the rumen nice and healthy. But overfeeding fiber in this period reduces intake. So these numbers are for NDF. With high quality pasture, they could be a little higher. But don't overfeed fiber. Prepartum, we want a lot of fiber in the diet. Postpartum, moderate. This immediate postpartum period, say the first couple of weeks of lactation, cows also need some starch. And I know starch is expensive in organic systems, but they need the starch because they have to make glucose. If they can't make enough glucose, they get ketosis. Ketosis is a risk factor for mastitis. So feed enough. 20% is getting pretty low for a fresh cow. It might be adequate after 3 or 4 weeks, but the first couple of weeks of lactation, 25% starch is a good number. That helps them eat, and again, it allows them to make enough glucose. Don't go higher than that because excess starch can cause some problems as well. But in the mid-20s, 22, 25%, that's a good number. Fat basically shouldn't be fed to these cows, fresh cows. If you want to incorporate some fat, oil seeds, so on, limit them. But especially the first 3 weeks, limit them severely. If you have oil seeds and want to feed those to get a little more milk later on, after 3 weeks, you can feed more fat. But in the immediate fresh period, watch total fat because it reduces feed intake. Hypocalcemia or milk fever. There is a very, very clear link between these two diseases, between hypocalcemia and mastitis. This RR is called relative risk, and all it means is that a cow with milk fever is somewhere 3 to 6 times more likely to get mastitis than a healthy cow. And even subclinical hypocalcemia have a higher risk for mastitis. There's several reasons. One is these cows are down, so their teats are exposed to more pathogens, more time. The teat sphincter with inadequate calcium does not close tight, so these pathogens can get up into the teat canal. Cows with milk fever have elevated cortisol. Cortisol is an immunosuppressor, so that sets them up. And then basically, again, I won't show you these data, but if we isolate immune cells from cows with hypocalcemia, these cells are low in calcium and they just can't function correctly. So there's a lot of very good data showing hypocalcemia is a major risk factor for mastitis. So we try to prevent, we set up diets to prevent subclinical and clinical hypocalcemia. Hypocalcemia, and again, I'm talking both subclinical and clinical, and surveys have shown 10 to 15% of the cows in the U.S., 8 to 10%, sorry, 8 to 10% of the cows in the U.S. get clinical milk fever, but about 50% of the cows in the U.S. have subclinical hypocalcemia. So this is a major, major problem. And we can prevent this with nutrition in most cases. It's a little more difficult with old cows and a little more difficult with Jerseys, but we can have a significant impact on hypocalcemia with nutrition. Basically, you talk to your nutritionist, you feed high magnesium, you feed the right amount of vitamin D, not too much, not too little, which is shown here, and you feed just the right amount of phosphorus, which is usually easy to do with the diets we have. These 3 things are easy. You might have to supplement magnesium, which is easy to do. The problem is the typical dry cow diet is much higher in potassium than it needs to be, and generally too high in calcium. And so you can try to get these down as close to these numbers as you can, and often this will help, but often it doesn't. But the first goal is just to try and get all these minerals exactly right. Dry cow mineral requirements are much more specific than lactating. They have to be excess, and not enough are bad for milk fever. So work on this. The alternative, and I don't know all the regulations on organic farming, but there are additives out there which provide chloride and sulfur. I'm assuming some of these are available that are approved for organic farming. And what you're doing here is, this is called the DCAD, and by feeding chloride and sulfur without sodium and potassium, you get this negative, and again, there's some physiological reasons, I won't go into it, but it is extremely effective at reducing hypocalcemia, clinical and subclinical. You have to have a pre-fresh group or some way to, these are not the tastiest additives. You need to mix this in with silage or some other thing to get them to eat it. It causes acidosis, and what that means is urine pH goes down. And for these things to work, urine pH should be around 6.5 or so. And so if you feed these, you've got to catch your cows, collect some urine, monitor pH, because too low was bad, too high means you're not getting the benefit. So this is very, very effective. You're having a lot of hypocalcemia and mastitis, and you can't do what I said on the previous slide. Think about these if they're allowed in organic system, because they're very effective, but they take a lot of management, and you have to do these right. Now, the second part of this is the direct effect on immune cells. What can we feed to make these cells work better? And this is almost exclusively related to antioxidants, or what we call oxidative stress. And oxidative stress is basically the balance between antioxidants and the production of what's called reactive oxygen species, ROSs. Oxidative stress occurs when you have more of these than the antioxidants can control. And we can do something about these, but not a lot. Diet, we can do a lot with these. There's a lot of antioxidants out there. The ones I'm showing here are the major ones, and they're in order, going from usually a problem to almost never a problem. In fact, manganese and iron here are light colors because they will probably never be, in the real world, never be a problem relative to antioxidant capacity. But selenium in feeds, which is totally dependent on selenium in soil, and if you're in Ohio, I guarantee 100% your feeds are deficient in selenium. Our soils are all deficient. And in most of the U.S., there are some pockets. Most of the feeds grown in the U.S. are selenium inadequate. So selenium is almost always needed to be supplemented in virtually every cow in the U.S. Vitamin E depends on the forage. If your forage is hay and silage, like in winter feeding, if you're grazing, but winter feeding, these forages are extremely low in vitamin E, and the cows are probably need supplemental vitamin E. If you're feeding good pasture, then supplementation probably won't be necessary, and I'll go into that in a bit. Copper in feeds is dependent on soil. I can't be too specific. Certain areas in Ohio have high copper, others are low. Most of them in Ohio are marginal, but you need to just basically measure the copper in your feeds, and you can make adjustments. Beta carotene, this is highly correlated with vitamin E. In other words, forages that have a lot of vitamin E will also have a lot of beta carotene, vice versa. But this is down a little bit because the data isn't as clear on whether beta carotene really helps mastitis. There's some data, but it's not as clear. And then lastly here, zinc, dependent on soil. For Ohio, most of our feeds are adequate in zinc, but it will depend on where you're at. So we're really looking at these nutrients. So we know at calving or around calving, there is a high concentration of these reactive oxygen species in cows. We also know they are in low antioxidant status for a host of reasons. And so what these animals are clearly in oxidative stress around calving. I also said this is when cows often get mastitis. And so we think there's very clearly a link here between antioxidant supplementation and mastitis. The reason why these cows are in this oxidative stress, one is while they were dry, they don't need to make a lot of antioxidants. A lot of these antioxidants are proteins, and they don't need them, so the cows don't make the antioxidant. And then when they start calving, they need them, and so they really just don't have them. I mentioned this low intake of nutrients. If they need selenium and they're not eating, they're not going to get enough. Also, right around calving, they're transferring a lot of these important antioxidants to the calf or to the colostrum. So they're taking it from, the cow is taking it from her body and giving it to the calf, which is very important for the calf, but it hurts the cows. And then ROSs spike at calving. One is calving is a very stressful event, produces a lot of these compounds, just do normal wear and tear on the tissues. The other thing is these ROSs actually are a trigger. It's what tells the cow it's time to have a calf. So we have high ROSs and low antioxidants. It sets them up for oxidative stress. These are the nutrients that there's good clinical data. It's not necessarily every study worked, but there is good clinical data that proper, and this is an important word here, proper supplementation of vitamin A, beta-carotene, copper, zinc, selenium, and vitamin E has been shown to reduce mastitis in controlled studies. Proper means you feed enough. You don't mean you feed too much. You feed enough. For example, if you're feeding enough selenium and you still get mastitis, feeding more won't help. It might hurt. It's especially true with copper. Feeding inadequate diets, feeding inadequate copper increases mastitis. Feeding the right amount of copper reduces mastitis. Feeding too much copper increases mastitis. So I'm not saying feed all this. I'm saying feed the right amounts and you should get less mastitis. And I'll get into the details on what the right amount is. Let's start with selenium. The data is unequivocal on selenium. It's been done. There's been studies conducted all across the world. There's been studies with goats, or cows, sheep, goats, and buffaloes, all the major milk-producing species. It works in all of them. And what's been seen is if cows are deficient in selenium, they have a higher somatic cell count, they have more mastitis, the mastitis lasts longer, and the cows get sicker. So there's absolutely no question you need to feed adequate selenium. Some questions you have, and I'll get to the adequate in a minute, but you have some decisions here on selenium, and one is both of these are approved for organic farms. There are certain types of selenium yeast. I don't know if they all are, but selenium yeast and selenite. Those are the two approved forms of supplemental selenium. This just shows if you feed yeast, we get higher blood values in the cow, higher blood values in the newborn calf, and this is important too, very, very increased selenium in colostrum. So feeding selenium yeast is very good to the cow, is very good at building up the selenium status of the calf. It also helps with the selenium status of the cow. But when we look at things like immune cell function, we don't see any effect. Both are good, but the selenium yeast was no better than the inorganic selenium. But it's very good at transferring it to the fetus or the newborn calf. This is a clinical study. And again, if you compare the blue bars, which is pre-supplementation, they're all with the light blue bars, post-supplementation, feeding selenite greatly reduced the number of quarters infected. Feeding selenium yeast greatly reduced the number of quarters affected, and there was no difference between these two. And feeding no supplemental selenium maintained a high infection rate. So based on clinical data on mastitis, it doesn't appear there's a big difference between selenium and yeast and selenite. Based on calf status, the selenium yeast is better. But just based on mastitis, either one does the job. So here would be the recommendations. Selenium is a regulated nutrient. The FDA sets limits. But basically, every animal on your farm, if you're in the state of Ohio, calves, heifers, dry cows, lactating cows, should be fed 0.3 parts per million supplemental selenium from pretty much the minute they're born to the minute they leave the farm. On lactating cows, in most cases, the inorganic is fine. It's cheaper, it's fine. The yeast would also be fine, but if you base it just on cost, I would go with predominantly inorganic selenium. Dry cows, you want to mix because you want to improve the selenium status of the calf. So I'm going to feed some selenium yeast in the dry cow. Again, it can be all of it, but if you're worried about cost, a portion of it. Then there's a problem here. Some areas of the country have high sulfate water. This affects selenium uptake, but it affects the uptake of selenite much more than selenium yeast. So if you're in an area where your water has a lot of sulfur, feed the yeast. Vitamin E. This just shows this immune function around calving, normal immunosuppression, what I've talked about earlier. This is plasma vitamin E. Oops. And it sees this big drop at about the same time. That's why we think there's a very clear link here. So we've set up experiments, and other people have, to say, well, what if we feed a lot of vitamin E right here? Will this help mastitis? And there's 3 studies right now. Actually, there's 4 studies that have proven this. Feeding extra vitamin E prepartum, shortly, a couple weeks prepartum, reduces mastitis. And I'm just going to show the one study we did several years ago. The light blue bar is the high vitamin E prepartum, just for 2 weeks, 4,000 units. This is infections, big drop. This is clinical mastitis, big drop. This is the recommended amount, which helps mastitis a lot, but feeding this extra amount for a week or 2 prepartum help even more. The big unknown here, though, is grazing cattle. This over here is confinement cattle fed no supplemental vitamin E. We see this normal big drop at calving. This is fed a fair amount of vitamin E. The levels are higher. It doesn't drop as much. Over here, this is a different study. These were grazing dry cows. They ate almost all pasture, a pound or 2 of concentrate. No supplemental vitamin E, and look at the levels. They still drop at calving, but even when they drop, they're higher than anything we see in confinement. So with cows on pasture, if they're eating a lot of pasture, they probably do not need supplemental vitamin E. They probably will not benefit from additional vitamin E in the prepartum period, pre-fresh period. Excuse me. So these are the current recommendations for confinement cattle, and this would mean if you're a grazing herd in the winter, you're a confinement herd, and vitamin E doesn't stay around. So when they're eating a lot of pasture, my guess is you don't need any supplemental vitamin E. But when they're in confinement, eating hay and silage, these are the levels. So if you've got cows calving in March, maybe even April, think about extra vitamin E prepartum. Once they get out on pasture, if your dry cows are out there, you probably don't need a lot of extra supplemental E. Copper, I'm just going to say there's data showing it helps, but there's data too much is bad. There's a balance. Don't overfeed copper. Some issues here with copper, though. Water again. High sulfur water reduces copper absorption. So if you have high sulfur water, you're probably going to have to modify copper supplementation. This iron thing is almost never an issue, so I'm not going to talk about it. There's some interesting studies, though, with grazing cattle, where cattle that are grazing have less copper absorbed than cows in confinement, fed the exact same diet, except in grazing, the cow grazes it, and then in the barn they do green chop and feed it. So the exact same diet, but cows in confinement had better copper status. We think this is because when cows graze, they eat some soil. Soil is high in clay. Clay binds copper. So for grazing animals, you might need to bump up copper a bit. So again, these are the recommendations, somewhere around 15 parts per million total copper. And then if you want these, there are several organic sources of trace minerals. They're better than the inorganics. If you have conditions with high water, high sulfur water, so on, grazing, I would probably consider the organic minerals. For zinc, somewhere around 60 parts per million total diet seems to be adequate. Vitamin A is involved in grazing because there's a lot of beta-carotene in pasture. Again, we don't know if grazing cattle need any supplemental vitamin A. I would probably put a little bit in to cover my bases, but they clearly don't need as much as confinement cattle, and whether they need any at all, I can't say. Beta-carotene, again, I don't know if this is approved for feeding organic cows, but on pasture it would be a total waste of money. If you're feeding in the winter and the hay is bleached and low quality, it might have some benefit. But again, I don't know if this is approved. So to wrap up here, first of all, feed the dry cow and the early lactation cow to prevent ketosis, substantial negative energy balance, loss of body condition, and hypocalcemia. These are critical to reduce the risk factors for mastitis. Second, trace nutrients, trace minerals and vitamins do affect immune function. But remember, too much can all be as bad as not enough. So your nutritionist will have a book called NRC, and that's kind of where you start. And you don't deviate in most situations too much from that, because getting too far away from or too high relative to NRC can suppress immune function, increase mastitis. This is just summarizing what I just said. Feed adequate copper, and in most cases it's around 15 parts per million total diet. If you're having antagonists like grazing, high sulfur water, I would feed organic sources. If you're not, the inorganics probably will work fine. Zinc, somewhere around 60 parts per million. Either one on organic or the inorganics. The organics always are a little more expensive. If you're feeding organic zinc, I'd be closer to the 50 than the 70. Selenium, again, every cow in the state of Ohio and most of them around the world should be supplemented with at least 0.3 parts per million. The law in the U.S. says that's the maximum you're allowed to supplement. For mastitis, whether it's selenium yeast or selenite doesn't appear to matter. To improve the selenium status of the calf, rely more on selenium yeast than selenite. And then lastly here, vitamin E. In confinement, dry cows should be fed 1,000 units a day, lactating 500 units a day. Pre-fresh, in confinement, more, 2,000 to 4,000. That's a wide range just because that's what the experiments have evaluated. With grazing cattle, the studies of feeding extra vitamin E prepartum have not been done, but based on blood levels and other things, my guess would be there would be very limited benefit or no benefit from supplementing cows that are eating at least 60% of their dry matter as pasture. Again, this is assuming the pasture is green and growing and lush. And I always like to end these seminars when I talk about nutrition and mastitis is, yeah, nutrition has an effect, or is the risk factor for mastitis. If you prevent metabolic diseases, feed adequate antioxidants, and get high intakes. But do not think you're going to control mastitis if this is all you do. Nutrition is just one part of it. You still need good hygiene, good milking systems, teat dipping, all the things we know about mastitis. You cannot just say, I'm going to feed more selenium and I don't have to worry about anything else. That you will end up in a catastrophe. So it's part of a control program. It should not be your only control program. And with that, I'll be happy to try and answer any questions. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Weiss. If you have some questions, please type them into your box, and I'll get those over to Dr. Weiss. I do want to let you guys know that this is a component of a number of webinars that we're sponsoring this season. The next one will be held on Monday, July 6th, Managing and Monitoring Hypocalcemia in Dairy Cows with Dr. Gustavo Schunemann. Also, later this month on Monday, June 29th, we'll be having an on-farm workshop on dairy herd health, again presented by OSU Extension veterinarian Dr. Gustavo Schunemann. Learn about herd health monitoring, record keeping, and how to perform an on-farm risk assessment with an emphasis on herd health and productivity to identified areas for improvement. Again, this is your opportunity to ask some questions. We have more information available on our web, and there are some resources here on your screen. So I appreciate you attending the webinar here on dairy nutrition and mammary health. Last call for questions. All right, well, I appreciate your time and look forward to another opportunity to serve your needs through this webinar series. I appreciate you showing, and Dr. Weiss, thank you.
Thank you.